Good afternoon. How's everybody doing? Great to be learning with you at a special time on a Tuesday. Thank you for understanding. We have an event tonight, the Lani Otto Hospital Benefit Dinner, where Nina and I are being honored, and I'll be giving a talk, which I'll be preparing for all afternoon, so we needed to teach the class at this time. Let's light up the darkness. Who's in the house? Sharon in New Jersey, Joe in the Inland Empire, Shandor in the Bronx, Bill in mid-Missouri, Nancy in North Carolina, Ella in Southern California, Marjorie in Georgia. Welcome, everybody. This episode of AT Daily is sponsored by Stephen Luftig, in memory of Shlomo Phillips. May the neshama of Shlomo have a great aliyah and elevation in the world of souls. We say amen. And Stephen, thank you so much for enabling us to share more Torah with more people around the world. And the merit of that, may you and all your loved ones be showered in blessings. And we say amen. Our daf today is page 173. Here in Tractate Bava Basra, the 23rd volume of the Talmud, working our way to the very end. We're in chapter 10, continuing our discussion of Mishna number 7 that we opened yesterday. So it's going to be page, God willing, 173 today, 174 tomorrow, Wednesday, and then Thursday, 175 and 176, which is short, so a double on Thursday. And with that, a siyum on the longest tractate in the Talmud. So a siyum on Thursday brings something to make a l'chaim. Okay, we're picking this up right at the top of page 173a. What we were discussing at the end of yesterday would be a promissory note that included the name of the borrower, but it said, I borrowed this money from you, such and such amount of money on such and such a day, but it didn't say the name of the lender. And now somebody's coming to court and saying, well, I'm the lender, I'm the you that was mentioned here, and I want to get paid back. And the concern is, well, maybe the original lender lost the promissory note, and this guy just picked it up and wants to get paid, and he's claiming that he was the lender. Can we be sure that it's him, or is this something that we are not concerned about? So, right at the top of page 173a, the Gemara asks, and what of that which is taught in another baraisa, that just as two men whose names happen to be Yosef ben Shimon cannot produce a promissory note, this one against that one, so that they cannot produce, so too they cannot produce promissory notes against others. So this case of the unnamed lender in the promissory note, we're going to learn something about that from the other case that was in our Mishna, where if there's a town that two guys have the same name, Yosef, the son of Shimon, Yosef ben Shimon. So they can't charge a promissory note one against the other, because one can say, well, actually, I lent you money, and then you paid me back, and I gave you back the promissory note that I made, so that you would pay me back, and then I gave it to you because you paid me back. Now you're going to use that promissory note to say that I lent you money, so that you lent me money and I owe you. Too much confusion because they have the same names. So to guard against that, we're just going to say these guys with the exact same name in the same town can't write promissory notes against each other if the only identifying feature is their name, because they have the same name. Now, what are we going to learn about that? What are we going to learn from that with respect to what we were just saying about the promissory note with no name in it? Well, let's see. Well, just as they can't make a promissory note against each other because they have the same name, so too they cannot produce promissory notes against others in that town, as those others can claim, I did not borrow from you, I borrowed from the other Yosef ben Shimon, and somehow the note that he was holding is now in your possession. Well, this Baraisa contradicts the Mishna, in which it was inferred that one of the two men named Yosef ben Shimon can produce promissory notes to collect debt from others. So with regard to what principle do our Mishnah and this Baraisa disagree? Right? So in the Mishnah, they can't produce promissory notes against each other, but they can lend to some other guy in the town and then get paid back. And this Baraisa is saying, no, you can't, because we're not sure which of the two Yosef ben Shimons actually lent the money. So what is the underlying principle that the Mishnah and the Baraisa disagree about? They disagree with regard to whether letters are acquired by transferring documents. Meaning, if I have a promissory note that says that so-and-so owes me money, can I just hand that promissory note to someone else? And now the guy who's holding the promissory note, he's the one that's owed the money? Or do I have to do something more elaborate in order to transfer the right to collect the debt? Does simply handing someone else a promissory note and therefore a right to have a loan repaid, if I just hand it to Johnny, does that mean that Johnny is now the owner of the right to collect that loan? Or do we have to do something more elaborate, and which includes the participation possibly of the borrower? Right? So one view is, yes, if you transfer the document, you transferred the right to receive what is recorded in the document. And the other view is, no, you can't just transfer the document and thereby transfer the right to collect what's recorded there. So the Tana of our Mishnah maintains that letters are acquired by transferring, meaning when you transfer the document, you also transfer the right to receive what's in it. And there is no concern that the promissory note was inadvertently transferred from one Yosef ben Shimon to the other by being lost and then found. As explained earlier, that's such an unlikely occurrence that, of all the people there was one Yosef ben Shimon and he lost a document. Of all the other people in that city, the one who found it was the other Yosef ben Shimon. Very unlikely. Nevertheless, there is still the possibility that one Yosef ben Shimon deliberately transferred the promissory note to the other, transferring the right of collection to him. He said, you know what? I got to leave town. This says it's money owed to Yosef ben Shimon. You're Yosef ben Shimon. I'll tell you what. If this is a right to collect $100, I think the guy's going to pay it in next month, but I got to leave town today. I'll sell you this right to collect $100 for $50. The other Yosef ben Shimon says, sure, why not? $50 today, I get $100 next week. I'll do that. And I sell him the note. So does that work? We're certainly concerned that it could. According to the Tana, the second Yosef ben Shimon is fully entitled to collect the debt by producing the promissory note. And the Tana of the Baraisa holds that letters are not acquired by transferring the document. So that even if one Yosef ben Shimon transferred his promissory note to the other, the new holder of the document is not entitled to collect the debt. Now, I think as I was making up that example, it occurred to me, I wonder if that you actually could do that. If there's a risk that it won't be paid back, or it's just a convenience to me to sell it today because I want to leave town, and I sell it to him for 50, but it's a right to collect 100, do we run into the problem of a prohibition on interest? He didn't lend at interest. He's actually just buying a financial instrument that's a promissory note that who knows when it'll be paid back, and he's undertaking a risk for that, or he's doing it for a convenience. But they haven't talked about buying and selling promissory notes. They're really only talking about transferring. So let's just say I gave it to the other Yosef ben Shimon. I don't know if it's going to collect or not. You, good luck. I got to leave town. See ya. So maybe I just gave it to him. So according to one view, if I give it to him, he has a right to collect. According to the other view, he doesn't. And if you wish, say that everyone, i.e. both the Tana of the Mishnah and the Tana of the Baraisa, holds that letters are acquired by transferring the document. I give him the promissory note. He now has a right to collect. And here, what they disagree about is with regard to whether or not the new holder of the promissory note is required to bring proof that the original creditor transferred it to him for collection, as opposed to his having received it for safekeeping or having found it by chance. Did I give it to him so that he now has the right to collect, and that was my intention, or did I just drop it and he picked it up? Or maybe I just gave it to him and said, hey, listen, I'm leaving town. I've heard that there's people breaking into houses. I don't want to lose this important document. You're going to be around. Please watch this for me. I didn't give him the right to collect the loan. I just asked him to watch the document for me. And this is as it was stated. Right. So do we say that he, if now is trying to collect, he's required to bring proof that the reason he's trying to collect is because indeed I transferred it to him so that he should have the right to collect? Does he need to prove that? So the Tana of our Mishnah holds that the present holder of the document is not required to bring proof that the debt was transferred to him, and therefore he can collect the debt through the promissory note that's in his possession. You have to prove it. He's got a promissory note. He can collect on it. And the Tana of our Baraisa holds that he is required to bring such proof, and in the absence of such proof, he cannot collect the debt with the document that he holds. And this is as it was stated, letters are acquired by transferring the document, meaning if you transfer the document, he gets the right to collect. And Abaye says the new holder of the document is required to bring proof that he has in fact acquired the right to collect the debt. But that's what Abaye says. Rava says he is not required to bring such proof. It is assumed that if he is holding the document, it was transferred to him knowingly by the original creditor. Abaye said, from where do I say that he is required to bring proof? Well, this is as it is taught in a Baraisa in the case of one of several brothers who are heirs of an estate, and one of the brothers has a promissory note in his possession listing a debt that was owed to the deceased father, and he seeks to collect the debt for himself. Well, in this case, it is upon him, this brother, to bring proof that the document was transferred to him legally by his father in his lifetime, or that it was bequeathed to him specifically out of all the brothers. And therefore, what he has to prove is that he did not appropriate it from the other brothers without their knowledge. Right? Was this a promissory note evidencing alone that the father, when he was alive, he lent money to someone, that someone owed money to the father died, so now who is owed that money? The estate. Therefore, all the brothers have a share in the proceeds of that repayment when it comes in. Unless the father, while he was alive, transferred this one particular promissory note to this one particular son, or bequeathed it to this one particular son. So now, if the son wants to collect the debt for himself, he's going to have to prove, yeah, I'm not, misappropriating this from my brothers. Dad gave it to me, or dad bequeathed it to me, and he has to prove that. That's what Abaye is saying. Or he's bringing down a Baraisa which says that. And so Abaye concludes from this, and what? Is the same not true for all others in a similar situation? In other words, whenever someone holds a promissory note that did not initially belong to him, he is required to prove that he acquired it legally. Sounds reasonable. And Rava said in response to Abaye, proof is not generally required in such a case. But in the case of brothers who are heirs, well, that's different, as it is common for brothers who are co-heirs of their father's estate to seize the property belonging to the estate from one another. So we have an extra condition on such brothers that they have to prove that they acquired the promissory note in a legal manner. But in the normal case of somebody holding a promissory note, even though he wasn't the original lender, he doesn't have to prove that he acquired it legally before he can collect on that note. There are those who say there is a different version of this exchange between Abaye and Rava. According to the second version, Rava said, from where do I say that no proof is required? As it is taught in a baraisa in the case of one of several brothers, heirs of an estate, who has a promissory note in his possession listing a debt owed to their deceased father, and he seeks to collect the debt for himself, it is upon him to bring proof that the document was transferred to him legally by his father in his lifetime, or that it was bequeathed to him specifically, and that he did not misappropriate it from the other brothers. Rav, in this version, Rav is bringing the same baraisa to prove his point that people normally don't have to bring that proof. Abaye, in his version, brought that baraisa to prove that people do have to prove that they acquired it legally. So how is Rava using the same baraisa to prove that a person doesn't have to prove that he legally acquired a promissory note? So Rava would say, the implication is that it is only brothers who must bring such proof, as it is common for brothers who are co-heirs to seize property belonging to the estate from one another. But others in a similar situation do not have to bring proof that they acquired the promissory note legally. So what's going to be Abaye's answer? He would say, there is no difference between brothers and anyone else. They all have to bring proof. So then why does the baraisa specifically mention brothers? Because it was necessary for the baraisa to mention the case of brothers, as it might enter your mind to say that since it is common for brothers who are co-heirs to seize property belonging to the estate from one another, one might say that brothers are careful to prevent such attempts. And therefore, when brothers produce a promissory note, they are not required to bring proof that they obtained it legally, as it is assumed that the other brothers would not have allowed the note to escape their possession otherwise. To counter this thought, the baraisa teaches us that brothers too must bring proof when they produce promissory notes. Now the Gemara returns to discuss the case of two men with the same name, Yosef ben Shimon. But what about that which is taught in another baraisa? The other baraisa says that just as the two men named Yosef ben Shimon can produce a promissory note against others, so too they can produce the promissory notes against one another. Right? The Mishna and this other baraisa we cited earlier both said that if there's two Yosef ben Shimons in the same town, they can't write a promissory note one to the other, because we won't know which one really lent to the other if it ever comes to litigation. Right? The way around it is they need to have further identifying descriptions or further names, etc. But if there's just two Yosef ben Shimons, a promissory note only says Yosef ben Shimon lent money to Yosef ben Shimon, they're not going to be able to collect on that. But now we have another baraisa, second baraisa, that says they can produce promissory notes against each other. So the Gemara asks, with regard to what do the Mishna and the first baraisa on the one hand and this new baraisa on the other hand disagree? And the Gemara answers, they disagree about whether or not a scribe may write a promissory note for a debtor even if the creditor is not with him. Earlier we said a potential borrower can have a promissory note written even if the lender is not there. Right? Because there's a scribe in town today. This guy who's going to lend him money is not going to come until next week when the scribe won't be in town. So the borrower says, please write me a promissory note today, and I'll use it next week when I borrow the money so that I'll be able to borrow the money. And we say this is okay. A scribe can write a promissory note for a borrower, even in the absence of the lender. Obviously, a scribe cannot write a promissory note for a lender in the absence of the borrower, because maybe the lender will never lend the money, but then he'll have the promissory note and he can try to collect against that guy who never actually borrowed. Okay, but a borrower can have a promissory note written in the absence of the lender, but maybe not everyone holds that way. The Tana of our Mishna holds that a scribe may write a promissory note for a borrower, even if the lender is not with him. And the Gemara explains. So what does that have to do with Yosef ben Shimon and Yosef ben Shimon? The Gemara explains, at times it could happen that one of the men named Yosef ben Shimon goes to a scribe and to witnesses and says to them, write a promissory note for me, as I wish to borrow money from the other Yosef ben Shimon. And then after they write the document and sign it for him, he will take it and say to the other Yosef ben Shimon, give me the 100 dinars that you borrowed from me, as attested in this document. Now, that is the reason why the Mishnah rules that, because you could do it as a borrower, but since they have the same names, now he's going to say, actually, I'm the lender in this document that I had written up, and I want you to pay me back, even though you weren't there. That's the danger when you have two people with the same name. By contrast, the Tana of the new Baraisa holds that a scribe may not write a promissory note for a borrower, even for a borrower, unless the lender is with him and consents to the writing of the document. So if one Yosef ben Shimon consents to the writing of the document before the other, they apparently trust one another, and there is no concern that the one holding the promissory note will defraud the other. So if we follow the ruling of no, you can't write a promissory note even for the borrower if it's in the absence of the lender, then we're not going to have that problem where one Yosef ben Shimon pretends to be a borrower and then acts like a lender, because they can only do it in front of each other. And if they do it in front of each other, even if the money doesn't change hands on that day, they evidently trust each other and we don't have to be concerned about it. New subject. The Mishnah teaches, if a document is found among one, so back to our Mishnah, Mishnah number 7. If a document is found among one's documents stating the promissory note against Yosef ben Shimon is repaid, and both men named Yosef ben Shimon owed money to this man. So then we don't know which one, right? So there's the document inside my files that say the promissory note that I had for Yosef ben Shimon has been repaid. Now both Yosef ben Shimons owed me money. I don't know which one repaid me. I don't know, and because there is evidence that at least one of them was repaid, now they're both considered repaid. That's what's going to happen. Right? The promissory note against Yosef ben Shimon is repaid. It says in this receipt or this note in my files. So, and because both Yosef ben Shimons owed me money, the promissory notes of both of them are considered repaid because it cannot be determined which debt was repaid and which one is still outstanding. And so the Gemara comments, the implication of the Mishnah is that the reason this man cannot collect his debt is that this note was found among his papers. But if it was not suddenly found, rather he was always aware of its existence, then he could present a promissory note against one of the men named Yosef ben Shimon and collect the debt from him. And the Gemara asks, but didn't we learn earlier in the Mishnah, nor can another person present a promissory note against either of them? Didn't we say that there's two Yosef ben Shimons in the same town, that you can't have a promissory note saying that one Yosef ben Shimon owes you money? You can't do that in such a town because you'd be sure which one owes you money. So Rabbi Yirmiyah said this later line in the Mishnah is stated with regard to a promissory note in which the debtors Yosef ben Shimon are identified by having their names tripled, meaning one of them is Yosef ben Shimon ben Reuven, and the other one is Yosef ben Shimon ben Levi. So their grandfathers had different names. We can distinguish one from the other. The Gemara questions this explanation. But let us see in whose name the receipt, i.e. the note stating that Yosef ben Shimon's debt has been paid. which one of them is written in the receipt? Now that we're saying they don't have the same name because we include their grandfather's name, so why is there any dilemma at all? The receipt should say which one of them was repaid. And Rav Hoshaya said the case is where the debtors are identified by having their names tripled in the promissory note, but the names are not tripled in the receipt. That's where the uncertainty comes up. Abaye stated a different answer to this question, that the Mishna is speaking about the borrower, not the lender. And this is what it is saying. If a receipt is found among the borrower's documents stating that the promissory note of Yosef ben Shimon against me has been repaid, and this borrower has borrowed money from both men named Yosef ben Shimon, so the promissory notes of both of them are considered repaid, i.e. they are not valid for collection, as it cannot be determined which debt was paid and which one is still outstanding. And the Mishnah teaches, what should two people with the same name in a single city do in order to conduct their business? They should triple their names, right? Including 3 generations, the name of their grandfather. And if their grandfather's names are also the same, and they have no prominent physical difference to indicate who is the one listed in the document, then they write that the one referred to in the document is a priest, if that is the case. And the sages taught the following continuation of the Mishnah in a Baraisa. And if both of them were priests, they should write several generations of ancestors until a divergence in names is found that can serve as a means of identification. Now, that's not as far-fetched as it sounds, because it can often happen that cousins have the same grandfather and were both named after the grandfather. So maybe they're both Yosef ben Shimon ben Yosef, where Yosef is their grandfather. So they're going to have the same family tree. They might also look very similar to each other because they're first cousins. So maybe what they're going to go with is Yosef ben Shimon ben Yosef, who's married to Esther Chaya, and the other, probably they didn't marry 2 women with the same names, something like that. And that concludes our discussion of Mishnah number 7 here in chapter 10. Now, Mishnah number 8. In the case of one who says to his son before dying, one promissory note among the promissory notes in my possession is repaid, but I do not know which one. The promissory notes of everybody who owes him money are all considered repaid, i.e. they're all invalid for collection, as it cannot be determined which debt was repaid and which are outstanding. And if there were found among his papers 2 promissory notes owed by one person, the one for the greater amount is considered repaid, and the one for the smaller amount is not considered repaid and can be collected. In other words, he has a bunch of promissory notes. He says one of them is repaid. He doesn't know which, so everybody's is considered paid, except that if one person owes him 2 separate loans, so this guy's holding 2 promissory notes for the same person. Okay, well, what he said is one of the promissory notes was repaid, and I don't know which. But this guy who gave him 2 promissory notes, at most only one of them is paid, so that guy still owes money. Is he going to owe the bigger or the smaller? He gets the benefit of the doubt, so we consider that the bigger one was paid off, and he still owes the smaller one. That's the Mishnah. Now the Gemara, quite short. Rava says that if a creditor says to a debtor who borrowed money twice from him, one promissory note of the 2 that I have of yours in my possession is repaid, without specifying which one. So the one for the greater amount is considered repaid, and the one for the smaller amount is not considered repaid and can still be collected. If the creditor said instead, the debt of yours that I have in my possession is repaid, then all the promissory notes that this creditor has from that debtor are considered repaid, as the term debt covers all the loans at once. Ravina said to Rava, well, if that is so, that when one makes an ambiguous statement, it is interpreted to his detriment, does the same law apply to sales? We've been talking about loans. What about sales? If a seller of land writes a document for a purchaser stating, my field is hereby sold to you, without specifying which of his 2 fields he is referring to, is the larger field that is sold, is it the larger field that is sold to him? And if he writes a document for the purchaser stating, the field that I have is sold to you, Is it so that all of his fields are sold to him? As the Hebrew word for field, sadeh, can refer to several fields as well as a single field? Are we going to interpret it this way because it was ambiguous that whatever he owns, we're going to have we're going to give the benefit of the doubt to the purchaser? And Rav explains, no. There, the holder of the document of sale is at a disadvantage, as it is he who seeks to take more property from the seller, so he must accept the minimal meaning. Here too, in the case of the promissory notes, it is the holder of the document, the creditor, who seeks to collect more money from the debtor. Therefore, the creditor is at a disadvantage. Whoever seeks to extract money or property from another, he has the burden of proof, and the benefit of the doubt will go against him. And that concludes our discussion of Mishnah number 8. Now, Mishnah number 9, which moves us into page 173b. One who lends money to another with the assurance of a guarantor cannot collect the debt from the guarantor. But if the creditor said to the debtor, I am lending the money on the condition that I will collect the debt from whomever I wish, i.e. either the debtor or the guarantor, then he can collect the debt from the guarantor. Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel says, if the debtor has property of his own, then whether in this case where the creditor stipulated this condition or in that case where the creditor did not stipulate that condition, he cannot collect the debt from the guarantor. He has to look to the one who actually borrowed, and if that guy has money, has property, okay, so get your repayment from the property of the borrower. Only when he has no property can you look to the guarantor, even in the case where he said, I can collect from whoever I wish. I can collect from whoever I wish sounds like, okay, the reason I lent the money is because I don't have to pursue this debtor. If the debtor's in some other town, but the guarantor is here in my town, I could just collect from the guarantor. But Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel says, no, it's not just a convenience. You have to look to the debtor first, and only if you can't collect from him will you go to the guarantor, even when you had that language. And so Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel would say, if there is a guarantor for a woman for her marriage contract, from whom the woman can collect payment of her marriage contract instead of collecting it from the husband, and her husband was divorcing her, the husband must take a vow prohibiting himself from deriving any benefit from her so that he can never remarry her. What does that have to do with guarantors? This precaution is taken lest the couple collude to divorce in order to collect payment of the marriage contract from the property of this guarantor, and then they will remarry and enjoy that property and go on their merry way. To prevent that, we make them take a vow that if the marriage contract is going to be paid to her from the guarantor, then this husband has to vow that he'll never remarry her. And then that will at least remove the strong possibility of a collusion. That's the Mishnah. Now the Gemara. The Mishnah teaches one who lends money to another with a guarantor cannot collect the debt from the guarantor. So the Gemara at first understands that the Mishnah is ruling that a guarantor's commitment is limited to when the debtor dies or flees. It's not just that if you can't get money out of the debtor, then you can look to the guarantor. This is saying something different. This is literally saying that what is a guarantor's role? To make sure that the person is present, the debtor is present to pay back his debt. According to this view, what is the reason that the guarantor's commitment is limited? And Rabbah and Rav Yosef both say that the guarantor can say to the creditor, you gave a man over to me to take responsibility for him if he dies or flees. Well, I have given the man back to you. Here he stands, collect your debt from him. The debtor is here before you, take your money from him. And if he has nothing, well, that's your problem. I brought you back the debtor. He's here. That was my role as the guarantor. Rav Nachman objects to this and says, this is the Persian law. The Gemara interjects, on the contrary, Persian courts go after the guarantor directly without even attempting to collect the debt from the debtor himself. Why then did Rav Nachman say that excusing the guarantor from payment is like Persian law? And the Gemara clarifies Rav Nachman's intent. Rather, Rav Nachman meant to say that this kind of ruling would be appropriate for the members of a Persian court who do not give a reason for their statements, but issue rulings by whim. Rav Nachman was saying that it is not fair or logical to excuse the guarantor and cause a loss to the creditor who was depending on him. Our understanding of a guarantor is not that the guarantor will bring, like a bounty hunter, will bring the debtor before the lender, and that's all his job is. That's not what a guarantor means. A guarantor means that if the borrower can't repay the loan, then the lender can get payment from the guarantor. Now, and this law is also taught in a baraisa. Oh, wait a minute. No. Rather, Rav Nachman said, what does the Mishnah mean when it says that the creditor cannot collect the debt from the guarantor? What it means is that he cannot claim payment from the guarantor at the outset until after it is established that the debtor has no means to repay the debt. It is only after the borrower defaults on the loan that the creditor can collect the debt from the guarantor. You have to try to collect from the debtor first. Only if he has no money, has no property, then can you look to the guarantor. And this law is also taught in a baraisa. One who lends money to another with the assurance of a guarantor cannot claim payment of the debt from the guarantor at the outset. Rather, he must first attempt to collect the debt from the debtor. But if the creditor said to the debtor, I am only lending the money on the condition that I will collect the debt from whomever I wish, then he can claim payment of the debt from the guarantor at the outset, bypassing the debtor. Right? So later, this is going to, it's a little unclear, but it seems to me that later this is going to be called an unconditional guarantee as opposed to the standard guarantee. But for now, what we're distinguishing is someone who just says, I'll be a guarantor, versus someone who lends and says, I am lending on the condition that I can collect from whomever I wish. Right? Then he can collect either from the debtor or the guarantor at the beginning. Rav Huna said, from where is it derived that a guarantor becomes obligated to repay a loan that he has guaranteed? Where do we find a source for this in the Torah? As it is written that Yehuda, reassured his father concerning the young Benjamin. I will be his guarantor. Out of my hand shall you request him. That's Genesis 43:9. And this teaches that it is possible for one to act as a guarantor, that an item will be returned to the giver. Now, what's interesting about that is they weren't talking about lending money and having recourse to the guarantor if the borrower cannot pay. There it really was that he will produce the man, right? Reuven was saying to Yaakov, don't worry, we'll take Benjamin down to Egypt where this viceroy said he has to see him before he'll give us food. And I guarantee I'll bring him back. I'll produce the man. But that verse is being used as a source to prove that we can have financial guarantee. Rav Chisda objects. This incident involving Benjamin is not a case of a standard guarantor, but a case of an unconditional guarantee. As it is written also in the context of Benjamin, that Reuven said, deliver him unto my hand and I will bring him back to you. That was in Genesis 42:37. One who undertakes unconditional responsibility for a loan has a different status than a standard guarantor, as will soon be elaborated, and therefore a biblical source has yet to be adduced to teach that one can become a standard guarantor. Rather, Rabbi Yitzchak said that the source is from here. Take his garment that is surety for a stranger and hold him in pledge that is surety for an alien woman. That's Proverbs 20:16. So the verse advises a creditor to take the garment of the debtor's guarantor as payment for the loan. Right? So you can look to the guarantor to repay the loan. And it is also stated in Proverbs 6, verses 1 through 3, my son, if you have become surety for your neighbor, If you have shaken your hands for a stranger, you have become ensnared by the words of your mouth. You have been caught by the words of your mouth. Do this now, my son, and save yourself, seeing that you have come into the hand of your neighbor. Go, humble yourself, and assemble your neighbors. Now, this last part of the passage means if your neighbor's money is in your possession, meaning you owe it as a guarantor, then open up the palm of your hand and repay him. And if it is not money that you owe him, but rather you have become ensnared by the words of your mouth and owe him an apology for a personal slight, well, then gather together many neighbors through which to seek his forgiveness. The point being that according to this verse in Psalms, there is this legal device contemplated in Tanakh, in the Bible, that one can become obligated as a guarantor for another in a financial matter. Al-Maimar said the issue of whether or not a guarantor in fact becomes obligated to repay the loan he has guaranteed is a dispute between Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Yosei. According to Rabbi Yosei, who says that a transaction with an inconclusive consent, known as an asmachta, effects acquisition, a guarantor becomes obligated to repay the loan. Whereas, according to Rabbi Yehuda, who says that an asmachta does not affect acquisition, a guarantor does not become obligated to repay the loan. Right? We saw this before, where somebody is saying, "Listen, if you know, as long as I will, what's it? I will repay this loan. I will repay this loan next year, or I will." I owe you $10, okay, but I'll owe you $100 if there's a blizzard in LA tomorrow. Now, obviously, I don't think there's going to be a blizzard in LA tomorrow. I'm just making a flourish as I'm talking. I didn't expect there to be a blizzard tomorrow. Maybe you had some knowledge of freak weather that was coming, and in fact, there's a blizzard the next day in LA. So do I owe the $100? So Rabbi Yehuda would say, no, because I never believed that there would be a blizzard in LA. I was just talking. And Rabbi Yosei would say, yeah, well, that's what you said, and now the condition happened. Now here what they're saying is the idea that a guarantor will end up having to pay the debt of some borrower. I mean, he was willing to stand and say, yeah, this guy's responsible. I'm sure he'll pay. Yes, I'll even stand as a guarantor. But the guarantor never thought he'd have to actually shell out the money to repay the loan. So Rabbi Yehuda would say that's an asmachta, an uncertain condition that he never thought would come to be. It came to be, we can't really obligate him. Rabbi Yosei would say, yeah, that's an asmachta, and he's obligated, and now the guarantor has to pay. Rav Ashi said to Al-Maimar that he was conflating two issues, and it is a daily occurrence that these two issues get conflated. On the one hand, an asmachta does not affect acquisition. We hold like Rabbi Yehuda. And it is also taken for granted that a guarantor does become obligated to pay. Maybe an asmachta doesn't create an obligation, but acting as a guarantor for somebody else's loan, that's not an asmachta. You are stepping up as a guarantor, and you will pay if that guy doesn't pay back. So rather, Rav Ashi said, why does a guarantor become obligated, and why do we say it's not an asmachta? Because of the satisfaction that the guarantor feels when the creditor trusts him and loans the money based on his guarantee. The guarantor resolves to obligate himself to repay the loan. Meaning, guaranteeing a loan is unlike a usual case of an asmachta, an obligation undertaken that is dependent on the fulfillment of certain conditions that the person doesn't really expect will be fulfilled, in which the commitment is not considered a real one. But here, in the case of a guarantee, the one obligating himself as a guarantor experiences a sense of satisfaction when the money is loaned to the debtor based on his word, and due to that, he fully commits to fulfill his obligation. And he knows that if push comes to shove, he will be looked to as the guarantor to pay, and he'll pay. I'm almost done. questions or comments, please get them in now. The Mishnah taught, but if the creditor said to the debtor, I am lending the money on the condition that I will collect the debt from whomever I wish, the debtor or the guarantor. So he can collect the debt from the guarantor. Rabba Bar says that Rabbi Yochanan says they taught this only when the debtor has no property of his own from which to repay the loan. But if the debtor has property, then the creditor cannot look to the guarantor from the outset, even if he said, I'm lending on the condition that I can collect from whomever I wish. And the Gemara questions this assertion. But from the fact that the latter clause of our Mishnah taught that Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel says, if the debtor has property of his own, then whether in this case where the creditor stipulated this condition or that case where he did not, he cannot collect the debt from the guarantor. So by inference, one can understand that the first Tana of our Mishnah maintains that there is no difference if it is like this and there is no difference if it is like that. Whether or not the debtor has property from which to repay the loan, the creditor can collect the debt from the guarantor, even from the outset, which would seem to be the anonymous opinion of the Mishnah with which the minority opinion of Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel disagrees. So it would seem like that would be the law. Now the Gemara clarifies the Mishnah is incomplete, and this is what it is teaching. One who lends money to another with the assurance of a guarantor cannot collect the debt from the guarantor before first claiming the debt from the debtor. But if the creditor said to the debtor, I am lending the money on the condition that I will collect the debt from whomever I wish, then he can collect the debt from the guarantor, even at the outset. In what case is this statement said? When the debtor has no property of his own from which to repay the debt. But if the debtor has property, no, the creditor cannot look to the guarantor initially. First, he has to try the guarantor, the debtor. And this is the law with regard to a standard guarantor. But in the case of an unconditional guarantor, even if the debtor has property of his own, the creditor can collect the debt from the unconditional guarantor. And this is why I'm not sure, do we say that the unconditional guarantor becomes an unconditional guarantor because the lender said, I am lending on the condition that I can collect from whomever I want? Or is there some greater language requirement at the time of the loan? I'm still not sure. And now at the top of 174a, we'll quickly finish. Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel says, if the debtor has property, in both this and that case, whether the guarantor is a standard guarantor or an unconditional guarantor, the creditor cannot collect the debt from either type of guarantor. And Rabba Bar says that Rabbi Yochanan says, wherever Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel taught a law in the corpus of our Mishnah, the law is in accordance with his opinion, except for the following three cases. The responsibility of the guarantor, apparently that's where we don't follow Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel. And also in two other cases, one that we saw in Tractate Gittin, page 74a, the incident that occurred in the city of Sidon, and the dispute with regard to evidence in the final disagreement that we see in Tractate Sanhedrin on page 31a, which is our next tractate. That's what I've got for us today. I'm seeing no questions. So have a wonderful afternoon and look forward to learning with you again tomorrow, Wednesday, at the regular Wednesday time, 6 p.m. Pacific. Have a great night.